Hello, everybody. It is Kyla here from Nutritional Revolution, and I have Kristin here today with us.
Hello, hello.
We are going to dive into all things altitude or training at elevation, heading to elevation, help you guys get some tools on how to alter maybe some things, whether that's calories, macronutrients, fluid intake to support your performance and adaptation to elevation. But before we dive into all the little nuggets, I think we should start out with, why do we even train at altitude? I think training camps, many of my athletes are going to training camps. Or do you see that happening as well, Kristin, with your runners?
Yes, especially this time of year. This is it's a really popular time for athletes to go down and go to Flagstaff or Colorado.
Yeah. And we are recording this in mid-May for those of you listening, potentially at a later date. Yes. So lots of training camp stuff happening this time of year for sure. I think also I've had clients where they go on vacation and they're at altitude, but they still need to maintain their training. And so there's times there where maybe there's things they could be doing to benefit those training sessions at elevation as well. And then, of course, if you have a race at altitude or elevation, we're going to use those words interchangeably throughout this podcast, by the way, that you'll likely want to get some exposure ahead of time at elevation so you can prep for that race. So those will probably be many of the reasons why you go to elevation. And so we'll dive into some of the benefits of training at elevation. So first big one, many of you have heard it, increased erythropoietin. I'm probably going to use the acronym EPO for the rest of the podcast there for erythropoietin. That's the big one people probably heard with, like, I'm going to say Lance Armstrong blood doping.
I
know. It's probably the first thing.
Sadly.
Yes. But EPO, you can increase it on your own legally just by going to elevation. You can actually also increase your EPO by doing sauna training. And that's could be a whole nother podcast, but that's kind of the big one that a lot of people are looking for when they go to altitude, because that EPO helps them deliver oxygen essentially a little bit more efficiently at elevation. And I think we have some stats here too with how improved your performance can become with every week at altitude. Do you remember that one, Kristin? I think you had that in there. I think it was like 1% per week or something like that at altitude with performance.
Yeah, I mean, ideally, the sweet spot is to be at altitude for 2 to 4 weeks. However, Kyla, you did bring up something interesting, and there are a lot of peer-reviewed studies on this now. If you can't make it to altitude 2 to 4 weeks prior to your race, which most athletes cannot, sauna utilization is actually a good tool.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I think I might have that in my notes later on in the thing.
Yeah. I think, like you're saying, the more the more elevation exposure you can get ahead of time, the better. And with that too, similar to sauna and talking about EPO, is kind of the more exposure you can get, the more benefit we see at elevation, right? So if you went up for just like 2 days, this Friday, Saturday, this come back Sunday, we're not likely going to get a whole lot of benefit from that elevation exposure. If you can get up there for, like Kristin said, 2 to 4 weeks, amazing. We're likely going to see some pretty good benefits in EPO production there. Once you come back down to your current elevation or sea level, those gains in EPO tend to taper off and return back to normal, I believe, within about 14 days. So you do want to make sure that you get that race or prime event in when your EPO is still high. So if you're doing that race, train high, race low. Yeah. So just keeping that in mind. There is a few other things that some of the research is looking into for potential benefits of training at elevation. However, some of them, the research is not either done in humans yet, or it is not done in athletes yet. So some of the stuff I came across in literature was elevated buffering capacity. This was one that was not done in athletes. So something, again, always consider the study population that they looked at. And then the other one was improvements in biochemical properties of skeletal muscle, specifically looking at mitochondrial gene expression. However, this was done in rat lungs. It was effective, but it was done in rat lungs. So that is something we need to keep in mind when we're looking at this stuff. And hopefully we'll get some more research, eventually down the road where we can
They are looking into more research on humans for other benefits besides the EPO, increase in EPO production. That I was just listening to that. So hopefully we'll get some good nuggets soon.
Yes, definitely. And then let's see, the other thing we'll kind of to add on to our first benefit of training at elevation, that EPO component. One thing we should bring up too is that we do highly recommend that you check your ferritin levels well before you're planning to train at elevation to get that benefit in EPO, because if your iron stores, that ferritin lab marker, is low, you're likely actually not going to be able to get that benefit in an adaptation to EPO. So you do want to make sure iron is in a good place well before you need to go to altitude, and that can take a while to get it into a good place. So checking those iron markers 1 to 2 months before you plan to go to altitude or before you plan to race at altitude can really give you enough time to potentially bring those markers back up so you can get that added benefit when you're at elevation.
Yeah. And I found a good, we can include it in the show notes. I found a good table of get your, I would say 2 months, 2 to even 3 months prior to your race or your altitude training, get your iron levels assessed. And it shows how much iron per day, how much supplementation you should take, depending on where your ferritin level is at that point.
Awesome. Yeah, that's excellent. We'll definitely put that in the show notes because I think that's super helpful. And then to kind of add to that is, do check your levels. So these suggestions are based off of your ferritin markers, right? So it's ideally you're using these suggestions knowing that you've done your labs and you know what your ferritin is. Iron is a metal, and it is something that if you supplement with it blindly and you have no idea what your levels are, you can absolutely overload with it and it can build up in your body, and that is not healthy. So you can absolutely overdose with iron. So that's why you want to test beforehand for sure. And then I think the big kind of question too that we get from many athletes is how much elevation gain is going to be the amount that's going to affect me. Or many of you probably notice you maybe go up 3,000 feet in elevation, you feel a difference. However, I will say that the vast amount of the literature looks at a bit more than that. They're looking at elevation changes somewhere between 2,000 to 3,000 meters, or about 6,500 to 9,800 feet of elevation gain is typically where the literature shows the vast majority of the symptoms occur. However, there appears to be decreases in performance, even in as little as 3,200 feet of elevation gain, or about 1,000 meters. And that can decrease performance by about 2 to 4% in some individuals. So that is what we're looking for. But I mean, of course, the higher you go, the more you'll likely notice that decline in performance. Some people might notice it at 500 feet. I don't know, but I guess it would depend on our fitness level.
Have you raced at altitude, Kyla? Like a high altitude?
No, I think Bend will be my first. I mean, that's not even that high.
No. Yeah. I did the Crusher and the Tusher gravel race, and the final push up to the ski resort where it ends, I think is at 9,800
Oh, goodness.
Feet. And, I felt pretty good until that final. I mean, it's like a steep road that you just keep going up.
Yeah.
And I mean, I literally have never felt this where I could not get any oxygen in.
Oh my goodness.
I had to hop off my bike and I could barely push it.
Yeah.
Sadly. And I don't think it was a training issue. I just think my body just didn't know.
Yeah.
How to handle that
totally
type of altitude. So
yeah. How long was that race? How many miles?
That was, it wasn't super long. I think it was 65 miles, but I think it has almost 8,000 feet of climbing in it.
Oh my goodness.
So yeah,
yeah,
it was a biggie.
that is. I remember working with one of my clients who was doing 100-mile ultras. He was doing the Grand Slam, and
Oh my gosh.
I remember looking at the elevation gain on one of his courses, and it was just one of the sections, just significant amount of elevation gain pretty quickly. And sure enough, like when we followed up from the race there, as he's ascending, he's getting the headache. He's starting to feel a little nauseous. And then as soon as he starts to descend, he's like feeling better and better and better. And so he finished. But there's definitely that noticeable, potentially like altitude sickness too, that can come with some of these races or things like that, where you just quickly peak potentially in a short amount of time too.
Yeah.
It can be scary. So kind of on that note, you mentioned sucking for air, hypoxia. That is one of the things that we see happen in our athletes. So when there's a decreased amount of oxygen particles per breath of air, it increases that respiratory rate. We're breathing a little bit harder. Our heart is working harder to try and get in more oxygen to the working muscle tissue. So some of the things kind of we want to be mindful of, and we're going to talk about the things that can happen, and then maybe some things that we can do to solve some of these situations. I mentioned hypoxia. Of course, there's not an immediate way to solve hypoxia. Of course, being properly hydrated can be really helpful. If you are dehydrated and your blood plasma volume is down, and you're also sucking for air, it's going to make the delivery and movement of that oxygen and nutrients to the working muscle tissue even harder. You're also not going to be able to control your core temperature as effectively. So that can be one of the ways. But of course, the primary thing to solve hypoxia is getting more exposure to altitude to get that EPO elevation and increase your body's ability to deliver and carry that oxygen. And then I mentioned dehydration or staying hydrated, but dehydration can be a big one that can happen for athletes at elevation. And that has to do with, as we go up in elevation, there is literally less atmospheric pressure in the air on the air particles. And so the air actually can get air quotes thinner, or the particles can be more dispersed in the air. And they also will they say it has less moisture holding capacity too. So that tends to be a little bit drier, so less humid. And so we are losing actually more of our, like you think about like the moisture in your mouth and your throat and your sinuses and your lungs. Each breath that you breathe out, you're losing some of that moisture to the air around you. So that can further that dehydration. And then there can also be a decreased drive to drink at elevation. So then we're not taking in as much fluids, but now we're losing more to the environment. So that can just compound, and we can become a little bit more prone to dehydration. So definitely wanting to consider definitely increasing your fluids, and we'll dive into details on that, but potentially including some sodium in your drinks or in your snacks if you're not running at the time or cycling, to increase your drive to drink. So the saltier things typically are, the more we will want to drink some fluids to balance that out. So add some electrolytes to your fluids for sure when you go to elevation. And then one that I think many people maybe aren't necessarily as aware of is weight loss can happen at elevation. And part of that is because of the dehydration, as we mentioned, but there's also a decreased appetite, and that can last actually anywhere from the first 3 days up to 3 weeks, I believe. And with that comes an increase in your resting metabolic rate. So Kristin mentioned like the higher heart rate and trying to breathe her air is like your body is working harder to do the same amount of movement, if you will, as it was trying to do at maybe sea level. So you're increasing that caloric expenditure to try and match what your body's trying to do at elevation. So there is that extra caloric expenditure out. And I think we may have some stats here on percentage further in our conversation. So we'll mention what that looks like, how much you potentially could increase your resting metabolic rate at altitude.
And so if you have ever like gone out for like a bike ride where there's a big climb, or if you're, training for a race and you're doing like 800-meter repeats or something like that, you'll notice that it's a lot harder to hit those same numbers at altitude than it is at sea level. And so basically, in order to, if you're trying to still hit those numbers, your body's working that much harder, burning that much more fuel to try to hit those numbers. So you need to keep that in mind with your training nutrition.
Yeah, definitely. And from some of the literature we were reviewing too for today's podcast, what I thought was really interesting is the weight loss that occurs, yes, can be dehydration, as we mentioned, but when we look at the types of tissue that are being lost, it's actually not mainly coming from body fat. It's actually primarily your muscle tissue that is being lost when you are at altitude, which is unfortunate and also very interesting. So that, of course, could be detrimental to your performance. So keeping in mind, not only do you maybe want to increase your fluids, maybe increase your calories, which we'll dive into because of that increased resting metabolic rate, but potentially, making sure you're really nailing your protein to minimize some of these lean mass losses as well.
Yeah, I did. I pulled that, the statistics that if you're in a low energy availability state at altitude, so basically not consuming enough calories based on the amount of energy you're expending in exercise per kilogram of fat-free mass, your muscle protein synthesis can drop by 20% in 5 days. And when you think about that, muscle protein synthesis is involved in building hemoglobin. So if you're in a low energy state for 5 days, you can actually almost mitigate, like you won't get any increases in hemoglobin production or the benefits of, your training camp at altitude. So just kind of keep that in mind and really pay attention that you're, consuming enough nutrients throughout the day.
Yeah, that's huge. The staying on top of that and knowing that even though your appetite might be down, to still try and hit what you were hitting, if not greater than that, from when you were back at sea level or your prior elevation. And kind of to add to that, I mean, the other big thing that can happen at altitude is suppression of the immune system. You talk about low energy, you talk about altitude affecting potentially your sleep quality, like all of these things can compound and have a suppression effect on that immune system. So, and there is also, as we mentioned, the decreased blood flow to the skeletal muscle that results in hypoxia. This is actually one of the big things that can suppress the immune system, actually. So very interesting there. So, and we do know that there's a higher risk, or we do see higher rates of upper respiratory tract infections for those athletes who are training at elevation. So just being mindful of that, getting in enough calories, getting enough sleep, making sure you're staying on top of that stuff.
Yeah. And this study also said that the safest way to address the possible increase in oxidative stress associated with altitude exposure is via the consumption of antioxidant rich foods rather than a supplement, because this may actually impair your training adaptations. So it goes hand in hand with making sure you're not in low energy availability. Like we want to really make sure we're getting all of these antioxidants via food rather than just taking a supplement.
Yeah. So with something like that, someone could make a smoothie. They could throw in when antioxidants are going to be in your dark, they're in a lot of stuff, but key quick areas are dark leafy greens and fruits and berries. I mean, you could throw those into your smoothie or something like that, put them on top of some Greek yogurt. Quick, easy ways to kind of get that antioxidant intake up a bit. Cherries is a big one. So let's see. We have talked about things that can happen at altitude, a couple of solutions to those, but we're going to dive into that in a little bit more detail. We mentioned that increase in resting metabolic rate. So we should most definitely be altering our caloric intake when we go to altitude, ideally increasing that intake greater than what we were consuming at sea level or at our prior elevation. Again, so long as we're, exceeding about 1,000 meters or more. And we did see that your resting metabolic rate can increase by as much as 28%. So just as an example here, if you were consuming, say, 2,000 calories on average per day, this would mean upping your intake by another 560 calories on top of that while you're at elevation. And again, I think I mentioned previously, but you can be doing this anywhere from 3 days up to 3 weeks at altitude. So everybody's a little bit individual on how quickly their resting metabolic rate kind of normalizes. So just kind of keeping that in mind and not under fueling, right? So hit your baseline minimum, but as Kristin mentioned, you don't want to be in low energy availability, and you likely will be if you're not going above that when you get to altitude. So that can be something to kind of definitely keep in mind. And then we're going to share in the show notes, if you guys want a free download on some recipes that will be some ways you can add in some quick additional calories as well as carbohydrates, we'll talk about in a second. You can click that link in the show notes to get that free download. But just as a quick example here, to add an extra 500 to 600 calories a day to your breakfast, lunch, and dinners. Some examples, this would be in addition to your current breakfast. So you could add an extra piece of toast with a half a banana. If for lunch, you could do an extra apple and a tablespoon of peanut butter, and dinner, you could add an extra cup of sweet potatoes roasted, and that would give you about an extra 570 calories for the day. So
it's not quite as daunting as it sounds.
Yeah.
A lot of people are like, well, I'm already not feeling super hungry when I'm at altitude. How am I going to eat an extra 550 to 600 calories per day? So just by adding a little something to every meal can really make a huge benefit and keep you from going into that low energy availability state.
Yeah, definitely. And we mentioned a handful of carb sources in there. So that kind of ties us into our next kind of topic here is not only should you adjust your calories when you go to altitude, but you should also be adjusting your macronutrients. And Kristin, I think you said this really well right before we started the podcast, but do you want to talk about like glucose utilization and what changes there or how it changes?
Sure. So when we're working at a higher capacity, and it varies for different individuals, like some of it's above 70% is where we start shifting from burning fatty acids for fuel to carbohydrates for fuel. And so when you think about it at altitude, in order to reach those same times that you're used to running at sea level, you're working that much harder. And so you're potentially pushing that limit above 70% where your body's preferring to burn more carbs for your workouts. So, inevitably we need to take in more carbs in order to perform, but also we're burning more. We have an increased metabolic rate. So we need to stay out of that low energy availability, state. And then as far as like at rest, burning more glucose, I think most studies, the research is still, I think there needs to be a little bit more research done, because a lot of the research at how much carb utilization increase is at altitude is more at like higher levels, basically where we don't train.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think we need to pull a few more studies, or more studies need to be done at that sweet spot of 2,000 meters to 2,500 meters for carb utilization at rest.
Yeah. I mean, it makes sense if your body you're trying to do the same, maybe 4-mile run or something like that you were doing at your home, but you're working that much harder to get that 4 miles done. You're breathing harder, you're running probably at a higher heart rate. And typically the higher the heart rate, like you're saying, the higher our reliance on glucose for fuel is. So, I mean, it makes sense. I did see too that there is possibly an elevation in they call the SIRT4 gene, which is responsible for suppressing fat utilization too. So maybe a combination there with that higher heart rate, working on the higher efforts, pushes us, at altitude potentially to rely a little bit more on glucose as a fuel source.
Yeah.
So we gave those examples previously for adding more calories. Many of those were carbohydrate sources, but I'll give another example here of a day where you can add in more carbs to your breakfast, or breakfast, lunch, and dinner, I should say. So could be just an additional extra half cup of dry oats, and then you add a cup of fruit to that. That could get you 50 grams of carbs. At lunch, if you want to add an extra whole wheat tortilla and a half cup of black beans, that'll give you another 50 grams of carbs. And then dinner, a cup of brown rice will give you another 50 grams of carbs. So as Kristin mentioned, it's not too crazy, but these are all in addition to your normal routine. And that'll give you an extra 150 grams of carbs for the day, just as an example. So, and then I think we didn't mention it yet, but we talk about daily carbohydrate intake and daily caloric intake, but training, as we mentioned, your reliance on glucose might be greater if you have that higher heart rate. The efforts are feeling harder. If you are normally maybe say consuming 60 grams of carbohydrates per hour during your training sessions, you might be able to push towards 75 grams of carbs per hour, even up to 90, so long as the gut maybe is trained for it to some extent, from a carbohydrate reliance perspective, and being able to hit those efforts that you're trying to do at elevation.
Yeah. So I'd say, start doing some gut training prior to your elevation or your training camp or your vacation to elevation. Try training the gut to be able to handle more carbohydrates per hour, because, it's still your gut. So it's not like all of a sudden you go to elevation, you need more carbs, but it's not like your gut can necessarily tolerate that many more. I notice when I go and train and race at elevation, like my appetite during workouts is also suppressed, or races, which is tough. And so you really need to get yourself on a schedule and make sure you're consuming those carbohydrates every, 30, 35 minutes, taking in some sort of simple carbohydrate. I tend to steer away from bars or anything that has a little bit of protein and fat, just because I do have a harder time digesting at altitude. I just don't have that hunger. And so I just choose simple carbs, gels, chews, sports foods, drinks. It's really good. You can always get it in a carb, heavy electrolyte drinks such as Scratch or something like that. As well.
Yeah, I think that's smart. And gut train before. You don't try and add in an extra 30 grams or an extra 50% intake on your gut.
It might be on the side of the trail then.
Yes. Yeah. No bueno. But yeah, I think that is like a game changer too, because you have all these combinations of things, like this increased likelihood of being dehydrated, which can result in fatigue. The decreased quality or quality of sleep also can add to daily fatigue. And then you have this increased RMR and decreased appetite. So maybe we're consuming less total energy. It's also going to lead to fatigue. And then now you're under fueling during your training sessions. You're going to feel beat at the end of that session, or, later that day, if you're not getting that energy intake in and hitting those targets. So yeah, definitely do yourself a favor and pack some extra fuel and carb rich, salty things to help keep you in a good spot. And I think the other piece we kind of want to hit and cover, of course, is hydration and fluids. And we touched on a little bit how we can definitely increase our rate of dehydration at altitude because of the drier air. And something too that I see can happen with athletes at altitude, where we can almost kind of make a little bit of a mistake in the sense of our perception of how much fluid we're losing, is that as the air gets drier, the air is more efficient at pulling the fluid from our sweat off the surface of our skin very quickly. And so the comparison I'll give is like a steam sauna or Hawaii, somewhere very humid, where if you're sweating many times, or even if you do a trainer ride in your house, you'll see a lot of the sweat pile up on the surface of your skin. You see it dripping off your body. It's very clear that you are sweating and it's obvious. Whereas when you are at altitude, many times we don't realize how much we're sweating because that sweat is evaporating so quickly. However, because it's evaporating so quickly, it can leave behind our salt crystals, making them more noticeable. And some athletes will assume that they must be maybe sweating more or losing more salt than they did at sea level, which is likely not the case. It's just the drier air. So, however, you do want to increase hydration just overall, because you are going to be losing not necessarily more sweat, but more fluid overall just via respirations and that kind of stuff. So do increase your fluid intake and include some electrolytes, but you don't need to go super crazy and like during your training sessions and add in, a whole bunch more sodium or things like that, because it may just be that the air is really dry.
Yeah, because once that sweat leaves our skin, once it's evaporated from our skin, we lose that cooling mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why we have such a hard time controlling our core temperature at altitude. It's, sweat is a cooling mechanism. And
Exactly.
Once that evaporates, once it's gone, we lose that. So just keep that in mind.
Yeah. Bring a plain bottle of water and you can wet yourself or get your hat wet or stuff like that can be helpful. Mm-hmm. And I think we mentioned a little bit, but definitely if you are under consuming your fluids or you are getting dehydrated, Kristin mentioned difficulty controlling core temperature. So you might be more prone to overheating, dehydration, obviously. You might experience more muscle cramping. You may be getting headaches, lack of focus. Performance is definitely going to start to decline for sure. That increased heart rate even further. And that can happen at sea level too. I've seen this happen with many athletes. If they start out a training session at their normal location, not even at altitude, and they're dehydrated, that can increase your heart rate a little bit more dramatically than you would have if you were properly hydrated. And then of course you could be getting dizzy and fatigued. So keep an eye on those things for sure. And don't rely on those drink to thirst cues when you're at elevation, because it can suppress your drive to drink. So as Kristin mentioned, set a timer on your watch. Maybe every 10 minutes you're taking a sip and, grabbing a little bite of something just to stay on top of that.
Yeah. Especially if you're in a race. I always make sure I tell my athletes, and I do myself, set my Garmin. You can set a little timer that dings at you every 10 minutes to drink. Because once you're in a race, you're laser focused and you tend to forget, you don't feel as thirsty. And once you're dehydrated, it's game over.
Yeah. It does make a big difference too, to get your fluid volume up. I mean, definitely during a training session, but also after. So if you can get like that recovery in, as we mentioned, to also, help with the muscle protein synthesis, because you might be losing more of that at altitude, but get those carbohydrates in, replenish that glycogen, and then get those electrolytes and blood plasma volume back up can make a big difference in your energy the rest of the day. And a kind of quick rule of thumb for that is if you happen to have a scale while you're at altitude, for every pound of weight you lose, if you weigh yourself just before you do your race or training situation and weigh yourself right after, you could even just do this once at elevation just to give you an idea so you know how to progress moving forward. But for every pound of weight you lose, you want to consume an additional 24 ounces of fluids to kind of make up for that. And the goal is usually to lose no more than 3% of your total body weight. So as an example, if you're a 150-pound individual, and you start at that weight, you should lose no more than 4.5 pounds or finish at 145.5 pounds at the end of that session. So, and that could be any session duration. So it could be an hour, it could be 5 hours. You should still lose no more than 4.5 pounds. So you need to manage those fluid losses as best possible.
Yeah.
And as I mentioned, if you guys want to check the link in the show notes to get the free recipe book for ways to increase your calories and carbohydrates at altitude or at sea level, go ahead and grab that. And we will include our references as well down there. And that table Kristin mentioned for the ferritin, I think would be a good thing to include for the listeners. Any other altitude nuggets you want to add before we finish up?
No, just eat and drink, make sure you go with a plan. I've done some 4-day stage races at altitude, and not only are you expending a ton of energy over 4 days, you need to really plan out your food intake for optimal performance and recovery. Don't forget about your recovery. Don't think when your session is over that you can skimp on, drinking electrolytes, as well as, carbohydrate and protein intake.
Yeah, I think that is smart. And of course, I will say it, we can help you program this out if you guys are interested in working with us one-on-one and getting some detailed help on how to do that. We do that with our clients. So I'm sure we have a link in the show notes to work with us as well if you guys are interested. So thanks for tuning in today. Thank you, Kristin, for all your nuggets of wisdom, and we will see you guys next time.